So morphogenetic fields are one kind of field within a larger class of fields. Another class of morphic field are the fields that organize behavior, behavioral fields, that organize the instincts and behavior of animals and indeed of people. Then there's one subclass of behavioral fields are perceptual fields, the fields through which we perceive and relate to the environment. And those fields stretch out beyond the brain into the environment. Those of you who were present on Thursday at my lecture will know I was mainly talking about that kind of field for about half the lecture. I think when we see something, the vision involves an inward movement of light and an outward projection of images within these perceptual fields, so that we're linked to what we're looking at through these fields. The observer and the observed are linked and interacting, as they say in quantum physics. So this means that you can actually affect things by looking at them. And I talked about the sense of being stared at, for which I've got a great deal of empirical evidence now, which is a phenomenon whereby people can actually be affected by being looked at. I think this is common in the animal kingdom. Animals can tell when other animals are looking at them. And I think it evolved in relation to predator-prey relations. If a prey animal can tell when a predator's looking at it, this obviously would be of survival value. Now, for those of you who weren't there on Thursday, this extremely brief summary may be going much too far too fast, but I don't want to repeat what I've already said, because most people, I think, did hear the earlier talk. So that's one kind of field of these perceptual fields. Another kind are the fields of social groups, where members of a social group are linked by a field that includes all the members of it. You remember that diagram of circles within circles. If you think of the organisms as circles, then the outer circle, then the outer field would be the field of the whole social group, like the field of a flock of birds or a school of fish, where the individuals are within this morphic field of the group. One of the implications of those fields is that if a member of the group goes away, the field is stretched, not broken, and so a communication is still possible at a distance. And that, I think, is the basis of telepathy in animals and people. And as I showed in my lecture on Thursday, telepathic links are quite common between pets and their owners, between people and animals. I think they're probably common in nature between animals and animals within social groups. And they're also common between people and people if they're socially bonded. And the commonest kind in the modern world is telephone telepathy, where people know when others are about to ring. Think of someone and then they ring. That happens, I think, because when we decide to ring someone, our intention reaches out towards them. They pick up that intention, this extension of our mind through intention, and may start thinking of us. On Thursday, I presented a lot of information from recent experiments that shows telephone telepathy really does happen. And I mentioned that our latest research is on email telepathy, which also happens to about the same extent as telephone telepathy. It's the latest evolutionary development of telepathy, where people think of someone and then they get an email from them. In the 19th century, this was commonest with letters crossing in the post, but now things happen so much faster with emails. One of the most interesting comments on letters passing in the post was made by Mark Twain, who said he'd often noticed that he'd think of somebody, he'd write to them, and then he'd get a letter from them the other day. In my book, I quote from a letter by Mark Twain about this, where he says he's noticed it so often, he's now saves himself a lot. He said he discovered he could save himself a lot of time and trouble by squelching the desire to write a letter to someone whenever he felt it, because the other man would write first, and it would save him the trouble. And he ended the letter, which was actually written to the Society for Psychical Research in London, by saying, however, in your case, he said, out of politeness, I am making an exception. So people have noticed this, but things are just so much faster nowadays with emails and telephones. So I spent a fascinating lunchtime with some people here who are ecologists, discussing whether ecosystems have morphic fields, whether they're superorganisms or not. This is a debatable point within ecology, and it's not a field I know very much about, so it was very interesting to be able to discuss this. Anyway, all these different kinds of fields, behavioral fields, morphogenetic fields, perceptual fields, social fields, are all examples of morphic fields. So morphic fields is like the generic name for a series of different kinds of fields, of which they're like species, morphogenetic, behavioral, etc. And all of them have in common the property of organizing systems, and the whole is more than the sum of the parts, and these fields organize and coordinate the parts under their influence. Now, one of the common features of all morphic fields is a kind of inherent memory. So far I've been speaking about the spatial aspects of these fields, the way they link things together in space. Now I'm going to talk about the temporal aspects of these fields, the way they link things across time and contain an inherent memory. But before I do that, I'm just going to give a thumbnail sketch of the history of notions about causation through time in Western science. So this will involve a lightning tour of ideas, starting again from the ancient Greeks to the present day, spanning 2,500 years in about 10 minutes. So I hope this won't be going too fast, but I myself find historical perspectives really helpful, and the basis of the entire theory is that history matters. So I hope that this will be helpful for those of you who aren't familiar with it already. The basic starting point for this is that I think there's a fundamental clash of paradigms within modern science, indeed within modern thought. There are two enormous models of reality which are colliding like tectonic plates and throwing up sort of volcanoes and earthquakes where they meet, because these two fundamental models of reality are fundamentally incompatible. We inherit one of these models from ancient Greece. We inherit the other model from the Jewish tradition. And Western culture is a kind of, seen in the most simple terms, is a kind of fusion of these two traditions, the ancient Greek and the Jewish. The ancient Greeks were obsessed with the question of eternity, possibly because they were influenced by mystical insights coming from the East. Many mystics have said that you can get into a state of insight where time disappears and you come into a timeless realm. Now, ancient Greeks, there were a number of mystery cults in ancient Greece, and they seem to be familiar with this kind of mystical insight. A lot of early Greek philosophy is an attempt to turn this sort of mystical insight into an intellectual theory, to formulate it intellectually or philosophically. And one of the big questions that ancient Greek philosophers dealt with is what remains the same behind the changing world of experience. We live in a world that's always changing. The weather changes, people grow old, everything's different. But they were looking for the changeless behind the change. Pythagoras was one of these theorists, and he said that what's changeless are mathematics, numbers and proportions and ratios of numbers. That 2 and 2 is always 4, the ratio of when you have strings, stretched strings, an octave, if it's twice as long, it's always going to be an octave different, the sound it makes. There are certain basic principles that underlie all of reality. These don't change. And this was the idea that underneath the changing world of experiences is a timeless mathematical reality. Plato was very influenced by the Pythagorean school, and the Pythagoreans were mystics. They were vegetarians. They believed in reincarnation. It was a kind of mystic cult, an esoteric movement. Plato was influenced by them, but he thought it was more than just mathematics. He thought there was every kind of thing in the world had an eternal form or archetype beyond time or space, an eternal idea written with a capital I when it's translated into English, an eternal idea or form. the atomists were another school of thought. They thought that the eternal reality was matter, and that matter was made up of lots of little tiny bits, atoms, which couldn't be split up, and which were eternal. And the changing world we experience is because of the movements and permutations of these atoms. They were the first materialists, and they date back to at least the 5th century BC. And then another view on this came from Heraclitus, who said the only thing that's constant is change itself. So there were all these different views about what it is that endures behind change. In the 17th century, there was a big revival of Platonism. This really started at the Renaissance in Europe. The Middle Ages were dominated by Aristotle's philosophy, but the Renaissance was the exciting thing for a lot of Renaissance philosophers was the rediscovery of Plato. And when science got going in the 17th century, it was a curious hybrid, mechanistic science, between atomism and Platonism. And so it's remained until this day in the way that most scientists think. On the one hand, people thought there was an eternity of matter made up of atoms, bits of matter moving around. But all this was governed by eternal laws of nature, which were mathematical laws. And for the founding fathers of science, like Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Descartes, these eternal mathematical laws underlying the world we experience were seen as ideas in the mind of God. They thought of God as a mathematician. Mathematicians like that idea. And it makes them, of course, of all people, closest to the divine nature. And theoretical physicists are still very keen on the idea that there's an eternal mathematical reality underlying the world we experience. Many theoretical physicists, when they speak in a rather mystical vein, talk about these eternal ideas which underlie the world in which we live, eternal mathematical ideas. So this is very deep-seated in physics, as is the idea of an eternity of matter and energy, summarized in the principles of conservation of matter and energy. There's always the same amount of matter and energy, and it's always governed by eternal laws of nature. So you've got an eternity of invisible, immaterial laws governing an eternity of matter and energy. And this is the way that physics was formulated until very recently. It's a very deep-seated habit of thought in physicists. Now, the other great paradigm of reality comes from the Jews. And in the Bible, there's a story of a process in time. The paradigm of history for the Jews is a journey. It's the journey out of bondage in Egypt, through the wilderness, and to the promised land. So this gives the idea of a process in time. And when the promised land turned out not to be a kind of restoration of Eden and paradise, but it turned out to be full of Palestinians who caused terrible problems then as now for the settlers in the promised land. In Jewish thought, there was the idea that there would be a future event, that history would move towards the second coming or the Messiah. And in Christian thought, this became the projection of the end of history, the coming of the millennium. A millenarial strand of thinking was very strong in the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the 17th century, this became secularized, and people started thinking in terms of human progress, of domination of nature through science and technology, and a progressive conquest of nature by humanity, and of human progress in general. By the end of the 18th century, the idea of human progress was a standard view among European and North American intellectuals. But they thought that progress only occurred in the human realm, that all other species were thought of as fixed. And it was through Darwin's theory of evolution in the mid-19th century that this progressive model of history was extended to all of life. So now all of life was seen as progressing from the origins in the primordial slime through organisms sort of crawling out onto land and gradually progressive ascent up to human beings who represented the crown of creation. And this is the pretty standard view that's widespread everywhere today. But physics still stuck to an eternal view. And in the early 20th century, Western intellectuals were often deeply pessimistic because they said, although there's this progressive movement of life on Earth, the entire universe shows no such tendency. If anything, it's running down towards a thermodynamic heat death, and everything is doomed to extinction as the universe finally grinds to a halt. However, there was a huge revolution occurred in physics in the 1960s with the Big Bang theory. And what that did was put the whole of cosmology onto an evolutionary basis. Suddenly, there was the idea that the whole universe started very small and very hot with the Big Bang, which is less than the size of a head of a pin. And then it expanded and cooled. And as the universe grew and cooled, new forms and structures appeared within it. Atoms, molecules, stars, galaxies, planets, finally life, all appeared within it. So finally, there was a radically evolutionary view of all reality. And so human progress was now seen against the background of biological evolution, which was in turn part of the much larger process of cosmic evolution. So in a sense, the evolutionary cosmology has taken over. But there's still a deep-seated habit of thought from the eternity model, which still dominates the thinking of many scientists, particularly physicists. This crisis becomes most apparent if you ask the question about the laws of nature. If everything's governed by eternal laws of nature, where were the laws of nature before the Big Bang? If they were all there before the Big Bang, then clearly the idea of laws of nature is metaphysical, because there couldn't be physical laws of nature before there was physics or a physical universe. And how could you prove the laws of nature were all there before the Big Bang? This is clearly an assumption, a philosophical doctrine, which follows from the Platonic philosophy. It's not really a scientific idea, it's a philosophical or metaphysical idea. And if all the laws of nature came into being with the Big Bang, then how come they were all formed at once, like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code? And how could we know if that was the case? As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern physics and modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the free miracle is that the entire universe and all the laws that govern it sprang from nothing in a single instant. And then it's assumed everything else follows these laws of nature. Well, what I'm suggesting is in an evolutionary universe, you can ask the question, well, why shouldn't the laws of nature evolve? Why should they all be fixed at the moment of the Big Bang? This is a pure assumption. It's a hangover from a previous mode of thought, from the old world view. And as soon as you begin to question the idea of laws of nature, you can question the very idea of laws of nature. Why should nature be governed by laws? This is the most anthropomorphic of all possible metaphors. As C.S. Lewis once pointed out, to say that a stone falls to earth because it's obeying a law makes it a man and even a citizen. Because only civilized human beings have laws. Traditional cultures have customs. So laws are a feature of civilized societies. In the 17th century, the metaphor was explicit. God was the lawmaker, like the emperor of the universe who made up the laws. They were eternal laws in the mind of God. He was also the universal law enforcement agency that made sure everything obeyed them, except perhaps people with free will. And so that it made sense. For most modern scientists, God is at best an optional extra for the world machine. And so what about these laws of nature? Most physicists still believe in eternal laws, as I say, as a kind of hangover from the old view. But both the idea they're eternal and the idea that they're laws are highly questionable. What I'm proposing is that in an evolutionary universe, it makes more sense to think of the regularities of nature as habits. Habits that evolve within nature, that grow up within it, depend on what's happened before, and which over time get more and more fixed. So the basic essence of the idea I'm putting forward is that nature has a kind of inherent memory. Instead of eternal laws beyond space and time, there are habits within space and time that develop as the universe goes along. Even if you want to persist with the notion of laws, which is based obviously on a human parallel, human laws evolve. The laws of the United States today are very different from what they were before the United States, when they were British laws, and then they change all the time. They're constantly being modified, both by common law, which we have in England and you have here, the principle of precedent, which leads to changes in law, and also through legislation, which leads to new laws. So even if you want a law metaphor, real human laws do change in time. So the basic idea is that the laws of nature may not be fixed and eternal. There may be a memory in nature instead of eternal transcendent laws. Now, I've worked this idea out in detail in relation to morphic fields, but I've put it in these very general terms so you can get the basic outlines of it in plain, straightforward English without any of the technical details. And when we so what I'm going to do now is come back to the question of morphic fields in general and say, well, how can we think of morphic fields? If morphic fields organize things in space, like developing embryos, social groups, and so on, how do the morphic fields come to have the properties they do? Well, one way to approach this, the way that most of my colleagues in biology would take, is to say, oh, well, morphic fields are just a shorthand way of talking about regular laws of physics and chemistry, which we don't yet know the details of, but we'll figure it out in time. And it's nothing unusual, it's nothing that we don't already know about, it's just a matter of working out the details. That basically amounts to saying we don't know how they work, but we will find out in the future along conventional lines. Sir Karl Popper called that attitude promissory materialism. He said it's like issuing promissory notes against future explanations. And many people do that. They say, well, we haven't actually figured it out yet, but we will in time. That's an act of faith. It may be, events may prove it right, they may prove it wrong, but it's not a scientific hypothesis. It's an act of faith about the way things may work out many years in the future. Some people who are interested in morphogenetic fields say that if they're fields, we've got to have mathematical equations that govern them, and so the task is to find out the maths behind them. And such people often feel that once you've got the maths, you're home and dry, because that's like the eternal equations that govern them. The trouble is that won't do in biology. If you had the mathematical equations, say, for the morphogenetic fields of dinosaurs, the maths is eternal. And you'd have the same equations at the moment of the Big Bang when the dinosaurs actually lived on Earth and now when they're extinct. It wouldn't make the slightest difference to the equations whether dinosaurs exist or not, because they're somehow beyond space and time. What I'm suggesting is that morphic fields depend on a kind of inherent memory. There's a similarity, on the basis of similarities, similar organisms in the past affect organisms now. And there's a process that I call morphic resonance, which depends on similarity. The more similar things are, the greater the influence across space and time of past forms. So each species, each member of a species, draws upon a kind of collective memory through morphic resonance and in turn contributes to it. So as a giraffe embryo develops, it's shaped by the morphogenetic fields of previous giraffes, which depend on the actual shapes of previous giraffes. If it tunes into all previous giraffes, there's a kind of averaging process as all these forms are superimposed, which gives a fuzzy outline to the fields. They're probability structures. One metaphor for this is provided by the technique of composite photography. These are average scientists from the John Innes Institute in England, and they're made by superimposing lots of different photographs one over another, 30 female and 45 male photographs. And what happens when you do that is you get a kind of average form. I think morphogenetic fields, if you could see them, would have the same kind of fuzzy outline. They're the kind of average of previous similar forms. And that fits with the idea that they're probability structures. They work in terms of probability. Their own structure is in terms of probability. So I think that each kind of morphic field has an inherent memory given by morphic resonance. The difference between this view and the standard view becomes apparent if you think about any number of physical or biological processes. If you consider crystallization, for example, if you crystallize something that's crystallized many times before, like salt or sugar, then I'm suggesting there'd be a tremendously well-developed habit for those crystals to develop in because of millions, billions of previous crystals. But if you make a new compound that's never existed before, the very first time you crystallize it, there won't be a pre-existing morphic field. You may have to wait for one to come along, however new fields come into being. If you crystallize it again and again, there will be influences from the previous crystallizations, so the morphic field will get stronger and the crystal should form easier. Now, by contrast, the conventional view is that the first time you make a crystal and the millionth time you make it, it's governed by eternal laws of nature, the laws of quantum physics, electromagnetism, etc. These laws don't change, so it should happen exactly the same way. It doesn't matter if it's been done a billion times before or never before, it's exactly the same. Well, in fact, when chemists crystallize new compounds, they often find that they're very hard to crystallize to start with. As time goes on, they get easier to crystallize all around the world. And this is usually attributed to fragments of previous crystals being carried from laboratory to laboratory and infecting the new crystallizations, either as invisible dust particles in the air, or commonly chemists tell anecdotes about bearded chemists transferring these crystals from lab to labs on their beards. So chemistry is full of a folklore concerning this phenomenon, which has never been rigorously tested. And I'm suggesting that if you keep bearded chemists out and filter dust, you should still get this effect. There are a number of interesting anomalies which chemists have found. It's pretty well known that things get easier to crystallize all around the world when people have made them. But there are sometimes cases where a new crystal form will unexpectedly appear, and suddenly people won't be able to get the old ones anymore, and the new one will take over. This happened very recently, in the last 10 or 15 years, with one of the drugs used to treat AIDS patients. I've forgotten which it was. I think it's retrovir, or one of those chemicals. I've forgotten the exact compound. There's a huge discussion about this on the internet. What happened was it was being made, it was regularly manufactured, it was put in capsules, and suddenly people couldn't get it. A new form turned up. It's called a polymorph, a different form of the crystal, appeared, and that took over. And suddenly everywhere people could only get the polymorph of the crystal. It was chemically the same, but the crystal had a different structure. And it had a different solubility, so the drugs didn't work the way they were meant to. And they had to reformulate the drug to have liquid formulation instead of a crystalline one. And it was a big problem. There are many other examples where in the chemical industry, people get certain kinds of crystals, and then mysteriously they can't get them again, and another kind suddenly takes over and suddenly springs up everywhere in the world. These would fit quite well with a morphic resonance view. And these are not things that were done deliberately to test this theory. They're just weird anomalies that happen over and over again in different branches of the chemical industry, which don't seem to make sense. There's another prediction in chemistry, which is that if you make a new compound and you crystallize it, the more often you do it, the stronger the field of the crystal should become. That means the compound should be more stable once it's crystallized. That means it should be harder to break it up. And how you break crystals up is by heating them. You melt them. If it gets more stable, the melting point should rise. Now, melting points, as any of you who've studied science will know, are supposed to be physical constants. You can get, every chemistry library has a big book in it, the CRC Handbook of Physical Constants, or the Merck Index. These are the two standard reference works. You can look up any chemical there, and it'll tell you its melting point and its boiling point. And these are supposed to be fixed. So what I'm predicting is this, that with compounds that crystallize in nature that have been around for millions of years, the melting points will be fixed because there'll be so much background morphic resonance from billions of previous crystals. Making a few thousand more or a few million more won't make any difference. There's a huge background effect. But if you have new ones, as you make more and more, the melting points might rise as the crystal forms become more stable. This, of course, is deeply heretical. If any of you have studied chemistry, you'll know that this is not the kind of idea you're going to hear in chemistry courses. They're meant to be fixed. So when I first thought of this, I started asking chemists if they'd noticed it, and I found many of them had. They said, well, sure, new compounds, they do seem to go up. I looked in the chemical literature. I dusted off back issues of the CRC handbook from the British Patent Office Library, where they keep them going right back to the beginning of the 20th century. And I found that you could track amazing increases in melting point of synthetic compounds first made in the 19th or 20th century, whereas compounds that crystallize in nature showed practically no change. These differences were big, in some cases up to 30 degrees centigrade. I then started looking at pairs of compounds which occur in nature and which don't occur in nature. For example, cocaine, the natural form which occurs in coca leaves, the melting point hasn't changed since the 1890s. But cocaine hydrochloride, the cocaine of commerce used by you extract coca leaves with hydrochloric acid, it forms this hydrochloride, which doesn't occur in nature. The melting point of that has gone up by about 10 degrees since the beginning of the 20th century. Among the amino acids, there are some that crystallize in nature, like asparagine and glutamine. Those have remained constant, rock constant, really, over 100 years. Whereas other amino acids which were first crystallized in the mid-20th century, leucine, isoleucine, many of these have had increases in melting point of up to 30 degrees centigrade. So there's actually, in the chemical literature, surprising evidence for changes in melting point. Now, chemists don't, of course, immediately say, gosh, morphic resonance must be true. Not at all. What they say is, well, okay, the melting points have gone up. They don't usually dispute that. But they say, well, there's another reason for it. The reason is this. Impurities lower the melting point, and as time goes on, people get better at making them, so you get purer samples, so the melting points go up. Not an unreasonable idea, but then you say, well, how do you know the later samples are purer? And they say, well, they must be, because they've got higher melting points. There's a circular argument. It may be true, but there needs to be independent evidence for it. And the reason why I think that it's not all there is to it is that when people have made synthetic versions of these compounds that crystallize in nature, like asparagine, cocaine, etc., those melting points haven't gone up in the same way. So I think there's something pretty interesting going on here. And this opens up a possibility for further research in the realm of chemistry, which could test for morphic resonance. Morphic resonance, I think, is, of course, at work in biological morphogenesis. Here at the top is a regular fruit fly, Drosophila. This, as you know, has been used very widely in biological research. And flies, all flies have two wings. The Latin name for flies is diptera, which means two wings in Greek. And they have here organs called halteres, which are balancing organs. The remote ancestors of flies were rather like dragonflies with four wings. And in the course of evolution, the second pair of wings has been reduced to these halteres, which serve a different function. There are certain mutant fruit flies called the bithorax mutants, where the halteres are transformed into a second pair of wings. This is almost like an atavism, a throwback to an ancestral form. And I think what's happening here is that the morphic field of these halteres, the structure from which they develop, as it were, tunes in here to the haltere field. Here it tunes into the wing field. It's like changing channels on a TV. You tune in by morphic resonance to a different field. Anyway, the point of this is that you don't just get this kind of fly by mutations. You can get them by breeding regular flies like this, putting their eggs in ether fumes about 3 hours after they've been laid, diethyl ether. If you do that, some of the flies, without any mutation at all, turn into four-winged flies, usually a very small percentage. This is called, in the literature of genetics, a phenocopy. It's where without a genetic mutation, you get the same effect by changing the environment as a mutation produces. It was found years ago by a biologist called Waddington that if you expose them to ether, about 2% of them change into the bithorax type with 4 wings. If you take eggs from those fruit flies and expose them to ether, a higher percentage change into 4-winged flies. And this is the percentage of 4-winged flies generation after generation, where you expose the eggs to ether in each generation. You get more and more and more of the abnormal ones till you've got more than 30%. If you stop exposing the eggs to ether, you still get lots of abnormal ones. It gradually falls off over a number of generations. There's an inheritance of acquired characteristics here. The interesting thing is that when this work was repeated by Mei-Wan Ho at the Open University in England, she found the same effect Waddington had found. But then, after about 10 generations, she exposed some new batches of fruit fly eggs whose ancestors had never been in ether before, to ether. The first generation, instead of 2%, now had 10% abnormal flies. The second generation, 20%. They, in relation to the same stimulus, far more of them changed. I think this is a morphic resonance effect from the previous fruit flies that had undergone this abnormal development. It became easier for others to do the same thing. These are totally weird effects from the point of view of conventional biology, and yet the data are quite strong. She did these experiments carefully. They're published in proper journals and so on. They're otherwise inexplicable. There are similar anomalies in the realm of learning. I would predict the same kinds of effects would occur when animals learn new tricks. The best known example, which I quote in my books, is of rats being trained to learn a new trick. This was done years ago at Harvard. A psychologist there trained rats to escape from a water maze, and he found that the first generation made more than 200 errors before they learned how to escape. The next generation got it quicker, the next generation quicker still. And it looked like an inheritance of acquired characteristics. Those of you who are biologists will know that this is one of the deepest heresies in biology, that you can acquire things, that you can inherit things that previous generations have acquired. Anyway, it got easier and easier for rats to learn the same trick. People didn't believe this, so they tried to repeat it in other labs in Scotland and in Australia. And when they started their rats off, they started off learning really quickly. They more or less took up where the Harvard rats had left off. And moreover, they showed that they continued to improve. And this didn't depend on the rats being descended from trained rats. Other rats of the same breed also improved in the same way. So it wasn't something going from parent to child. The whole breed seemed to be getting better. This would be an example of morphic resonance. It gets easier for all of them to learn it. I think in the human realm also, when many people have learned a new skill, others should find it easier to learn. It should be getting easier for people to learn skateboarding, snowboarding, computer programming, any number of skills. And we have a lot of evolution of skills going on today in video games and in sports, particularly innovative areas. There's a lot of evidence that people are getting better at learning these things, but of course there are other variables as well. You see them on TV, techniques of teaching improve, the gadgets people use get better, and so on. So in order to test for it in the human realm, you need to have some standardized test which doesn't change over the years and where people keep the data. Well, Olympic records are one area where they have been getting better and better, but there's an increasing pool of people competing, so it could simply be sampling further and further extremes of the normal distribution curve. However, there's one area where there are good quantitative data over very long periods, and that's in IQ tests. It was discovered in about 1982 that there'd been a tremendous increase in IQ test scores in Japan, that people had got better, about 20% better since the Second World War. IQ tests had gone up. And this led to a tremendous flurry of interest, especially in the American press. There were headlines in the New York Times like, Japanese overtake US in IQ. And at that time, everyone was terribly afraid of Japan. They thought they were going to take over the whole world. don't think that anymore, but anyway, they did then. And so people got really worried. And they looked at the US data, and they found there had been similar increases in the US. It's now been found this has been happening all over the world. There have been major increases in IQ steadily over the years. But there's no independent evidence that people are getting smarter. So what's going on? Well, I think what's going on is people are just getting better at doing IQ tests, because so many people have done those standardized tests before. This theory can be explored in a number of ways, and there's already evidence also from animal behavior, from spontaneous animal behavior, that there seems to be a collective learning going on. One case I find particularly interesting is cattle guards. We call them cattle grids in England. I think you call them cattle guards here, those rails across the road that cattle don't walk over. Cattle guards were invented around the end of the 19th century, and of course are a very simple way of preventing cattle and sheep from escaping from fields. And to start with, they had to learn the hard way. It was very unpleasant for a cow to put its feet in those gaps. However, what's happened now is that most of them don't even try. If they see a cattle guard, even a calf that's never seen one before, it won't try and cross it. I interviewed a number of ranchers about this, and one of them said that when these calves come near to it, it's as if they put on brakes with all 4 feet, and they just stop. Now, some ingenious ranchers in the United States have made use of this discovery. I don't know who discovered it. It's one of these fascinating things that someone found out, and it's spread without ever being commented on in the scientific literature. I think it's been going on for at least 30 or 40 years. But all over the West, in places like Arizona, California, Nevada, and so on, ranchers have discovered they needn't waste money digging holes and putting rails across. They can just paint phony cattle guards on the road, and they work just as well. State highway departments now do that in the western states of the US. It wouldn't work in places where there's a lot of mud. But in the drier parts of the US, this is now common practice. There are hundreds of thousands of phony cattle guards in the US, saving large amounts of money, and they work perfectly well. I think the reason they do is because of a kind of collective learning on the point of view from the cattle, so they don't even try to cross them. A similar evolution has happened in relation to barbed wire. When barbed wire was first introduced into Texas and places in the late 19th century, there was terrible damage to horses that used to get tangled with it, and they had gaping wounds. And a number of people said, this will never catch on, it's too dangerous for animals, they'll never learn. Now barbed wire is used everywhere, and there's hardly ever any problems with it. Even young animals don't go near it. So there's been a learning there. Also, when cars first were introduced, horses used to shy and bolt when they saw cars. Now even young horses that have never seen one before are perfectly happy with them. So there's been many examples of collective learning that have been documented over the last 100 or 150 years. I think all of these could be examples of morphic resonance. In the human realm, this collective learning means that we all tap into a kind of collective memory. And this is very similar to the idea of Jung, the psychologist Jung, who talked about the collective unconscious. Someone raised this earlier today. And I think Jung's idea of a collective memory, a collective unconscious, makes perfectly good sense in the light of morphic resonance. In fact, if it didn't exist, it would have to be invented. I think we all tap on a collective memory. We all draw on a collective memory and in turn contribute to it. One of the most radical implications of the idea of morphic resonance is that we don't just tune into other people's memories in a kind of collective way. We may even tune into ourselves in the past. In fact, I would expect us to do so specifically. Morphic resonance depends on similarity. Between people, the most similar are the ones who will resonate most. Identical twins are the most obvious case in point, and I think that helps to explain why there are often extraordinary similarities in the lives of identical twins separated at birth. This is often taken to support a kind of genetic determinism. If people find that twins are so extremely similar, even if separated at birth, they assume that it must all be programmed in the genes. However, if morphic resonance is happening, it may have quite a different explanation, and the entire edifice of genetic determinism that is based on these twin studies, this edifice of sociobiology, selfish gene theory, may collapse like a house of cards if morphic resonance is going on, because it could explain these data in a completely different way. But the person who is most similar to each one of us in the past is ourselves. We're most similar to ourselves in the past than we are to anyone else. And therefore, the most specific morphic resonance working upon us from the past would be from our own pasts. What I'm suggesting is that we tune into our own past by morphic resonance, and I'm suggesting that our memories work by resonance from the past, not by storage of memories inside the brain. Now, we've all been raised to believe that memories are stored inside the brain. This is part of the materialist theory of the mind, which says the mind is the brain. Since we have memories, then the memories must be in the brain. It's been taken for granted for a very long time. People have tried to find memories in the brain over the years. There have been many attempts to find them, and all these attempts have failed. It hasn't made people give up the theory. Whenever they don't find them in one place, they say, well, they must be somewhere else. And Karl Pribram originally put forward his holographic theory of memory storage to account for the fact that people were just unable to localize them in particular places. The Canadian neuroscientist Wilder Penfield thought he'd localized memories by stimulating particular regions of the brain and evoking memories. He later came to the conclusion that he wasn't actually locating the memories there. It was those parts of the brain were involved in recovering the memories, but they weren't where they were stored. So I'm suggesting that we tune into our own pasts as well as into other people's. The other people are less specific, our own more specific, but individual memory and collective memory are two aspects of the same phenomenon. There's a difference of degree, not of kind. Of course, you'll be thinking, well, what about brain damage and Alzheimer's disease and other forms of memory loss? Well, what I'm suggesting doesn't, those things fit perfectly with this view. The easiest analogy to understand this is the television set. When you switch on your TV, you see pictures on the screen, you hear sounds coming out. But those are not stored inside the TV set. They're coming from invisible transmissions from elsewhere. If you damage the TV set, if you snip a few wires in the sound part of it, the TV set will become aphasic. It'll stop speaking. You'll still see the pictures, but it'll lose the ability to produce sounds. That doesn't prove all the sounds are stored or made inside that bit of the TV set. It proves it's essential for receiving them. You can change other bits of the TV set, mutate condensers or resistances or transistors, and you can distort the pictures. Or you can even get the thing to jump onto a different channel. But that doesn't prove it's all arising inside the TV set. It merely shows that the TV set's essential for the reception and processing of what's been tuned into. I think our brains are like that, and that damage to the brain can lead to loss of memory. It can lead to specific losses, and like a stroke can affect speech if it's on the left-hand side of the brain, just like clipping out transistors from a particular part of the TV set can affect the kind of distortion or damage you get to sounds or pictures. So I think that things like Alzheimer's disease affect the ability to tune into memories, but I don't think they necessarily are abolishing the memories themselves. Of course, it looks like that because people lose their memory. But it may just be that they can't receive the memories. They're potentially present. I'm suggesting, in fact, that all memories are potentially present everywhere. It's just a matter of tuning into them. That's the basic thesis summarized in the title of my main book on this, The Presence of the Past. I think that this tuning into the past is what happens in all organisms, and particularly in us, when we remember things. This has all sorts of far-ranging implications. if we tune into particular people's memories in the past rather than just a generic collection of memories, we might even have memories of particular past lives. That wouldn't necessarily prove we are that person reincarnated, but it might just be that for some reason we have a specific tuning into a particular person's memory. There is good evidence that some young children can remember previous lives. This is the work of Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. So it has big ramifications for understanding past life memories. It doesn't refute or support reincarnation. It leaves open that question, but it says that you could explain it just in terms of tuning into memories. The question of whether you are that person or whether you're just getting that person's memories is another discussion. It also has very big implications for the question of survival of bodily death. Materialists say the mind is the brain, and one reason they like that thesis is that at one stroke they can refute every single religion by a simple argument. Memories are stored in the brain decays at death, therefore all memories are wiped out. Very simple. Now, all religions believe there's some form of conscious survival of bodily death. If it's a reincarnation, then it may be an unconscious survival. There's some kind of memory transferred from life to life. Otherwise, there'd be nothing to reincarnate. And Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, religions that have ideas of some afterlife, take the Christian idea of the Last Judgment, for example. If you didn't have any memory, that wouldn't make sense at all. You'd appear before your Maker at the Last Judgment. And if you've forgotten who you are and everything you've done, the Last Judgment would be totally meaningless. And so it implicitly presupposes some kind of survival of memory. So if all memories are stored in the brain and wiped out at death, all these religious theories are instantly refuted in a simple argument any child could understand. That's one reason materialists are so attached to the mind is the brain theory. It reinforces their worldview. Many conventional Christians believe in survival of bodily death and yet go along with conventional science in a very uncritical way and end up with two completely incompatible systems of belief. I find some people who oppose the kinds of ideas I'm putting forward can be at the same time conventional Christians and conventional scientists. And yet they hold two belief systems which are totally opposed to each other, completely inconsistent. All of us, of course, are guilty of all sorts of inconsistencies. But what I'm saying is that if memories are not stored in the brain, the question of survival is left open. It doesn't prove survival of bodily death, but it doesn't rule it out either. Whereas the conventional theory does rule it out. It doesn't leave the question open, it leaves the question closed. Well, I think I'll just finish by this part by talking something about creativity in evolution. If morphic resonance is happening, if nature is a system of habits that grow up through repetition, they become more habitual, then this won't in itself explain evolution, because habits involve repetition. Repetition isn't enough to explain evolutionary creativity and innovation. I think evolution must involve an interaction between creativity and habit. There are two basic principles. Habit stabilizes what's happened in accordance with how many times it's been repeated. Successful habits get repeated often and become more habitual. Unsuccessful evolutionary innovations die out and don't become habits. So habit is part of it, and that's the part that morphic resonance and science can deal with, because science deals with repetition. But creativity is an essential part of evolution. If we didn't have creativity, nothing new would ever happen. For creativity to happen, it's usually necessary for habits to be blocked. We know that from our own lives. If left to our own devices, we just carry on along grooves of habit. And we don't change our habits unless we're forced to, usually. And we're not even aware of our habits. But if we live, since nearly all of us do, we live with other people and have to interact with other people, they all too often point out our more annoying habits to us. And sometimes our habits become seriously dysfunctional, in which case we have to do something about it. One of the things that psychotherapists do is help people to become conscious of unconscious habits of emotional reaction, thought, or behavior. And usually we don't change unless we have to. So if habits are blocked, something new can happen. In evolution, the blocking of old habits in plants and animals can happen by several means. One is a change of the environment, so the old habits don't work anymore. Another is a mutation that cripples the organism in some way, alters the way it works, so it has to develop new habits. And in human life, all sorts of things cause us to do something new, anything that blocks our old habits. Where creativity comes from is an open question. In my books, I leave this open. I put forward a variety of possible theories. But science deals with repetition, and then you can put it within a larger worldview that deals with creativity. For materialists, creativity will ultimately always be a matter of blind chance. For people who believe that there's a creative principle inherent in nature, there would be a kind of organizing intelligences within nature that give rise to creativity. For those who believe in God, then there'd be a divine source for the creativity in nature and what happens in the world. And this is very much an open question. It doesn't matter which of these views you take from the point of view of science, because everyone can agree that once a new thing's happened, then science studies the way it repeats, the repetition. So I think evolution involves this interplay of habit and creativity. Well, this is a very rapid overview of ideas which are worked out in much more detail in my books. And sometimes we can spend days in seminars and so on exploring these ideas. I hope it hasn't gone too fast and made it seem completely incoherent or impossible to understand. If you're interested in the details, the summary, the first statement of these ideas is in my book, A New Science of Life, which is more technical, a brief but technical or semi-technical presentation of them, mainly based on developmental biology and chemistry. A fuller development of these dealing with the realms of society, mind, memory, as well as biology and chemistry is in The Presence of the Past. And then I summarize these ideas in the appendix to my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, and also in my book, The Rebirth of Nature. But the fullest statement is in The Presence of the Past. Well, people sometimes ask me how I came to the idea of morphic resonance and so on. The answer is that I got onto the idea of morphogenetic fields through working on developmental biology. I spent years at Cambridge working on plant development, as I briefly mentioned this morning. And the idea of morphogenetic fields is a fairly standard idea within developmental biology. So I didn't invent that idea, I just tried to take further an established principle. The key idea of morphic resonance and influence across time came to me through reading the philosophy of Henri Bergson, the great French philosopher, who wrote a book called Matter and Memory, first published in English in 1911. And Bergson was at the time a very well-known philosopher. Now very few people read him. Thank you. And he was thinking only of conscious memory, but he gave a withering critique of the standard materialist theory of memory and showed how memory was a relation in time that would involve a direct contact across time. And I found his ideas hugely stimulating, and I was really excited by them. And I was thinking about morphogenetic fields at the time, and then I realized that his memory idea, combined with the morphogenetic field idea, would lead to something like morphic resonance. And so the germ of these ideas came to me a long time ago. This was in 1973, when I was a research fellow at Clare College in Cambridge. And so the basic stimuli for these ideas came out of Western philosophy and Western science, the holistic ideas of Goethe, who had a big influence on my thinking in biology. And not really very much to do with any esoteric or philosophical system. But then when I went to work in India in 1974, I took up a full-time job in India in an agricultural institute. I found that when I talked about these ideas, there was a completely different reaction from the one I had in Cambridge. When I talked about these ideas to my colleagues in the biochemistry department in Cambridge, you can imagine they didn't meet with tremendous enthusiasm. And there was a sort of overwhelming skepticism and saying there's no problems, everything's been solved, we haven't solved it yet, we will in the future, there's no need for new theories, it's completely unnecessary. So, I mean, basically just a complete lack of interest. When I talked to my Indian colleagues when I was working in India, I found the opposite response. People would say, oh, there is nothing new in these ideas. Everybody has known them from ancient times. Ancient rishis have said this many years ago. And so it was like, and then then I tried to persuade my Indian friends, not that there was an influence across time, they took that for granted through the theory of karma, but that there was a need to try and test it scientifically. That they couldn't get. I mean, I found most of them, many of my colleagues at the Plant Breeding Institute where I worked were geneticists. And when they were at work, they were perfectly conventional Mendelian geneticists. In the evenings, when I went to dinner with them and we had vegetarian meals, their wife was in the background lighting joss sticks to Ganesh and other gods and so on, they became conventional Hindus and believing in reincarnation. And when I pointed out that there was a conflict between reincarnation and karma and Mendelian genetics, at first they denied there was a conflict because they believed in both. And then, if they admitted there was a conflict, then they would say, well, there was just, the Western science is still in its infancy. They would say. So, I couldn't really get them enthusiastic about doing experiments. So I found the opposite problem when I was in India, that people reacted in this thoroughly blasé way towards these ideas and didn't really want to see it as science or as something you could do anything about. I didn't really come into contact with theosophists until I'd been in India for 3 or 4 years, and then I went to South India, and I wrote my first book in Father B. Griffiths' ashram, a Christian ashram. On the way there, I stopped off at Adyar, which I'd heard about, the world headquarters of the Theosophical Society, which I found a really congenial atmosphere. And I found that there it was possible to discuss these ideas in a much more stimulating way, because there were people there who were open to science and traditional knowledge. And I found that a really stimulating atmosphere, and I found the library there quite helpful. But I wouldn't say that the basic ideas came to me from the theosophical tradition or even the Hindu tradition, although living in India and thinking about these things was much easier than trying to think about them in Cambridge, where there was it was like walking in molasses in Cambridge to try and, there was such a viscous drag. Whenever I tried to think of any new ideas, people's only aim seemed to be to try and prevent any new ideas happening. And everyone in Cambridge, it's a kind of free fire zone for new ideas. As soon as you say anything new, everyone opens fire. They want to shoot you down before you've even got more than a few inches off the ground. Whereas in India, I had the opposite experience. You meet strangers on the train, and after they'd said, where is your native place? And what is your name? Then they'd say, what is your view of the universe? And and you'd be into sort of vast metaphysical speculations within minutes. So I found that actually much more congenial as an atmosphere for thinking about these things. But and I found that among theosophists I met a very good atmosphere for discussing things. I wrote my book in India, and then I went back to Cambridge, and I spent another 1.5 years rewriting it, because I got about 100 different people to read it. I got a tremendous amount of criticism, much of it constructive, and I then rewrote it in the light of that. So I found this interaction between Oriental ideas, philosophy, open-minded theosophists, and and tough-minded Cambridge scientists, really creative. Any one of these groups wouldn't have worked for me, but it was this combination that worked very well. And then I found, after I'd done this, that Jungian psychologists told me, oh, well, this is very like what Jung said. And I started finding lots of parallels. But really, for me, the key, I would say the most important single influence was the philosophy of Bergson and the tradition in biology of morphogenetic fields from developmental biology, from the holistic tradition in biology. At the back.
How does resonance relate to the Indian idea of prana?
Well, I think the Indian idea of karma is that there's an prana. Oh, prana. Well, prana is breath, isn't it? It's the breath principle. It's the moving principle. I think that it's hard to say exactly how that would correspond. Resonance is, of course, a vibratory or rhythmic thing. Breath is rhythmic. It happens in cycles. I think that it's also a kind of energy flow. But prana is not really the principle of form in Indian philosophy. It's not really what gives things their shape or form. It's what gives them their life or vitality. And you need that. I think it's more like energy than it is like fields. But it's hard to map these ideas exactly onto Indian concepts. And also Indian concepts have quite a wide... If you try and... One of the things I found in India, whenever I did try to do that, was I'd think I'd got the idea, and then somebody would say, oh no, there is another school of thought, and then you'd hear some other view of prana or karma or whatever. So it's hard to do an exact mapping. No, you. Yes, you.
In your book, Chaos, Creativity, and Cosmic Consciousness, on page 40 it says, one thing that's clear is that chaos is feminine, and creation out of chaos is like creation out of the womb, and all containing potentiality emerging out of darkness. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Did I say that? Well, there's 3 people in the book. Is that in my... Did I say it? Oh, all right. Well, I think in the Western tradition, when people have metaphors of creativity, there's the bottom-up metaphors are usually feminine, welling up out of the darkness, coming out of the womb. The feminine mode of creativity is things gestate in the womb and then emerge. And metaphors that Jung liked, like the welling up from the collective the collective unconscious, or all these are sort of feminine metaphors. And in the Bible also, the chaos, the primal chaos, is the feminine principle. In Babylonian mythology, Tiamat was the chaotic state of affairs before the creative power of God comes into contact. And we read in the book of Genesis, the Spirit of God moved over the face of the waters. So it's like the divine spirit moving over the face of the waters, which is like the primal ocean of chaos. Top-down theories of creativity usually involve male models. You know, the spirit descends from on high, new forms come down or are breathed down from above. Those are often male models of creativity. But obviously, as we know from the fact that these things, the male and the female, are obviously the splitting apart of a sexual metaphor of creativity, obviously you need both. I mean, that's how new life occurs, through both coming together. But I think in these metaphors of darkness, the dark womb, the welling up of chaos, that is the feminine side of it in most traditions. Mm. You in the front, yes. Yes, you.
Do you have a theory on how awareness comes about?
That's a difficult question. I think there's probably, awareness and consciousness are not necessarily interchangeable, and some animals may have forms of awareness which are not necessarily conscious, at least in the self-conscious. I think there are some insights from sensory physiology here. I studied physiology when I was at Cambridge, and I think one of the things that the physiology of the senses has to tell us, which is really important, is that our senses detect difference or changes. We're not usually aware of things if they stay the same. If there's a background noise, you don't notice it. But if it stops, you notice something's changed. If there's a familiar smell, you soon habituate, you get used to it. But if there's a new smell, you notice it. If you're looking at a landscape and everything's static, you don't notice it. If something moves, it instantly captures your attention. So awareness is usually an awareness of difference or movement or change. And so it's true even of the way the newspapers work. You know, if something happens the same every day, it's not news. You know, dog bites man is not news, but man bites dog is news. Anything unusual is news. So I think awareness is very much to do with difference, change. What happens to an animal that notices difference or changes, it will respond to these differences or changes. It's obviously aware of them in the sense it responds, but to what degree it's conscious is another question. And I think our own awareness, when you're driving a car and you're talking to someone, you're thinking of other things, you're of course aware of when corners are there and where other cars are, but you're not consciously aware, as it were. It happens automatically. But if something starts going wrong, you can't go on talking, you have to concentrate. And so awareness is an elusive concept, but it's always to do, I think, with movement, change, and difference. Yeah.
Mostly any philosophical or scientific breakthrough has ethical implications, or people like to deduce ethical ideas.
Yes.
What is your thinking if you go from your hypothesis of formative causation and try to deduce any ethical standards, ideas, implications from that?
Well, I think that one of the things it does is shows that we're more responsible for our thoughts and attitudes than we might otherwise be. Everyone agrees we're responsible for our words and our actions. But if our attitudes and our thoughts can affect other people, which morphic resonance would suggest they can, and also this telepathic connection would suggest they can, we're much more permeable to other people's thoughts and attitudes than we might otherwise be. So we become more responsible for the way we think and the kinds of attitudes we hold, because they can affect others as well as ourselves. That's one consequence of it. That's, I think, a feature of this theory, a necessary consequence of it. I don't know if there are many other ethical consequences. I haven't been able to think of them, but I have to say I haven't spent a lot of time trying to think of them either, because I treat this as a scientific hypothesis. But I think that greater responsibility is probably the most important point that emerges from it.
Because I'm thinking about Darwin and the implications, which were, like social Darwinism. That was like a very influential ethical.
Yes.
It had very influential ethical sides to it, which I can kind of imagine your hypothesis might have too.
Yes, well, I think this one emphasizes the importance of interconnections and our location within social groups. This is not an individualist philosophy. I mean, I would say individuals are rooted within larger social groups, families and communities and so on. And so this tends to play down extreme individualism and also the idea of extreme isolation. The standard view says our individual minds are located inside our heads, insulated from everybody else in total privacy. It's not like that on this view of things. Yes?
You've mentioned, or you've defined your fields as areas of organizing principles that the so-called ancient wisdom would say that there's something very similar, except there are organizing intelligences.
Yes.
Everything is the greater is within the higher, and so on. And we see your body as nestling intelligences as well as nestling fields.
Yes.
If we use the word intelligence as opposed to organizing principles, we have a different spin on that, but it's very much an old principle. Are you trying to avoid deliberately the idea of an intelligence because that has a moral or ethical or religious connotation, and you want to keep it in the scientific way?
Well, it's partly that the the word intelligence for most people would, most ordinary people who haven't read this esoteric literature think of intelligence as something that's involved in intelligence tests or people with high IQs. It lends itself to more confusion than clarity. I think all these organizing fields have a kind of inherent intelligence in the sense that they're able to reach their goal or attractor in an unusual way. Like the field of the newt's eye, when I showed that regeneration of the lens of the eye. You could say that's a kind of creative intelligence inherent in that field. An unusual damage has occurred to the eye, and somehow the field of the eye is able to restore that damage in a new, creative, and unusual way. You could say that as a kind of intelligence. I think I myself tend to use the word intelligence as in relation to the fields of celestial bodies. Something I discuss in my book with Matthew Fox, The Physics of Angels, is the possibility of forms of consciousness beyond our own. And, for example, the question of does the sun have a mind or consciousness? I myself think it probably does. Materialists are prepared to agree that the interface between our own minds and our brains are the complex electromagnetic patterns inside our brains. The sun has vastly more complex electromagnetic patterns than our brains do. And there's now a huge amount of evidence for the complexity of the chaotic oscillations, 11-year cycles, all sorts of resonant patterns of activity in the sun's electromagnetic field. Maybe these are the interface with the mind of the sun. I think the sun, the entire galaxy may have a mind. I would think of those, the traditional use of celestial intelligences are like the minds of the heavenly bodies, which I personally think they may have. We organized a small symposium in England on Is the Sun Conscious?, to which we invited some cosmologists, some anthropologists, mythologists, because most traditional cultures assume the sun is conscious. In Hindu mythology, it's Surya, it's a god. Children, when they draw the sun, have a smile and eyes. It's a person, it's a god. And we spent 2 or 3 days discussing this question. The first day was taken up by some of our more conservative colleagues sort of saying it's a meaningless question, etc. But then we got on to the, well, okay, if the sun is conscious, then what does it think about? Well, part of it would be like the brain of the solar system. So the activities of the whole solar system, it's like the central point of this whole system. But then, of course, it's got a peer group, other stars within the galaxy. And so what would stars do with each other? I think actually this is a vastly unexplored realm of what sorts of minds or consciousnesses might exist at higher levels than our own within the visible cosmos. I'm not now talking about invisible spirits, but about the intelligences of the celestial bodies. I think there's a huge realm of unexplored speculation here. So I myself use that particular word more to do with the sun rather than the morphogenetic field of a newt's eye.
I was just noticing that it seemed like there would need to be an organizing intelligence directing the creation of all the little fields within it, each one successively controlling, to achieve the end result.
Yes, I think that if you have a hierarchy of organizing fields, then the creative intelligence of the higher level ones, like of the whole solar system, may affect what happens on Gaia, on the planet Earth, and the field of Gaia may affect what happens on ecosystems within it. So there's, I think, a kind of top-down causation. Normally, these fields work in accordance with maintaining habits or repetitions, but when things start going wrong and some creative innovations needed, there's a kind of intelligence that works through these fields. There's someone at the back, right at the back, the lady, yes.
Did you morphogenetic fields and Jungian archetypes and ancestor spirits? I mean, is there a distinction for you between those, or are they?
Well, I think that what Jung called archetypes were patterns of shared experience that people had had over many generations. So, for example, the mother archetype would be like a collective memory of many children or infants of the mother and the breasts of the mother and the nurturing power of the mother and so on. So he did see these archetypes as kind of collective memories, and that would fit very well with what I'm saying. What was the other word you were into? Oh, ancestor spirits. Well, all traditional cultures believe that the society is more than just the present members of it. There's an invisible presence of the past in the shape of the ancestors. In African societies, it's taken for granted that the ancestors are present in the society. And this traditional view that the society is more than just the present members but includes the ancestors fits very well with the idea that each social group inherits by morphic resonance influences from the past. This also works in certain forms of psychotherapy, particularly the psychotherapy of a German called Bert Hellinger. Some of you may have heard of. He's very big news in Germany. He works on family fields, and he thinks that often disturbances within a family depend on an inherited pattern from past families over the generations that disturbs the whole field of the family and affects the way people interact within it. And I think the most interesting point about morphic resonance and ancestors is the role of morphic resonance in rituals. All societies have rituals, and all rituals have a common feature that they enact some primal event, which is a key event in it's a kind of foundation story for that society. So when people carry out rituals, these rituals are highly conservative, and people carry out rituals both in order to affirm their membership of that social group and their contact with those who've been part of it in the past. Obvious examples include the Jewish Passover festival, the Christian Holy Communion, and then national or secular rituals like the American Thanksgiving dinner, referring back to the first Thanksgiving dinner of the settlers in New England. And when people carry out a ritual, they usually do so in a highly conservative way. You have to have the right kind of food, the right words, often a ritual language which is highly conservative, Sanskrit in India, ancient Egyptian in the Coptic Church of Egypt. It's the only place where the ancient Egyptian language is still used. In the Church of England, many people prefer the Elizabethan English of the Book of Common Prayer in the King James Version. And people feel that by doing it the right way, the right smells, the right movements, the right words, the right gestures, the same way it's been done before, this is necessary for the ritual to work. And I think that what's happening there is that by doing things in exactly the same way or as similar a way as possible, it creates conditions for morphic resonance. So the present participants in the ritual will resonate by morphic resonance with everyone who's done the ritual before, right back to the first time it's done. So there's an invisible presence of the past. And the present participants in the ritual are linked by this resonance through the ritual to the ancestors, all who've done it before. And this is one of the ways, by taking part in a Passover feast, that Jewish children are integrated into the Jewish tradition. Taking part in a Thanksgiving dinner is the way in which new Americans, immigrants and so on, become integrated as Americans. They're taking part in this national ritual. And, of course, taking part in the Holy Communion is one of the ways that Christians become part of what's called the communion of saints, which is the collective ancestors, as it were, in faith, going right back to the beginning. So I think these are very important principles, and they make very good sense in terms of morphic resonance.
I was hoping you could give me some perspective on life and death. Like
Yes.
A man or a woman make a baby, and then the baby does whatever, and then it dies.
Yes. Well, this is a very big question, of course, and I did actually work on death before I started working on life. I mean, one of my things I did at Cambridge was a whole theory of aging and death, because I was very interested in why do things die. One reason things die is because they stop growing. That's why animals die. In the case of plants don't necessarily have a fixed lifespan. You can have a big tree, and the tree will go on and on and on growing until it falls over. But then you can take a cutting from that tree and plant it, and it'll go on growing. One reason plants don't age is because they go on growing. And I think there are cellular reasons for this. But I won't go into this particular theory of aging now. But In the case of animals, I think death is a consequence of stopping growing. We reach a fixed size, and then death becomes inevitable. Well, I mean, all of life works in terms of these cycles. All of nature works in terms of cycles. Stars have life cycles. They're born, they grow old, and they die. This just seems to be the way most of nature works, in a cyclical manner. When things die, obviously their material constituents get recycled. And there's also an influence from every form of life or every pattern of organization to the collective memory, which contributes to the ongoing processes. The question of conscious or survival of death is another question, and personally I believe in it. I'm a Christian, I believe in a life after death. But that's more a matter of faith than of scientific proof. I don't know of any conclusive proof of life after death, but I think that the kind of science I'm interested in leaves that question open. Other questions arise, even if you think human beings consciously survive death. Do dogs and cats? Do other animals? You know, where do you draw the line? Is there a kind of... Are there lots... When our guinea pigs died, when our children were young, I mean, they asked me, do they go to a kind of guinea pig heaven? Well, I had to say, I don't know. You know, it's lots of questions open up here, and most of them I don't think we can answer. No, it's okay.
With regard to phantom limbs that would have at one time been healthy, then perhaps diseased for a number of years, then ultimately amputated, would the field have become more accustomed? Then the phantom would be a diseased limb, or would it automatically revert to healthy?
Well, sometimes people who've lost limbs have pains in the limb that relate to the problem that it was amputated for. For example, there's one American veteran whose foot was blown off by a landmine in Norway in 1944 or 45, who has given me an account of his experience. And he said that he still has the phantom, but very often he gets a pain in the foot where it was blasted by the landmine. And so that pain that was the cause of him losing his leg is still there. So sometimes they do retain a kind of memory of whatever it was that caused the limb to be lost. Interestingly, there are certain kinds of loss of limb where the limb ceases to have any sensation in it. I'm thinking here of leprosy. When people lose fingers or organs through leprosy, which is a wasting disease that erodes the pain, they don't feel the sensation. One reason that leprosy leads to people getting damaged is they can't feel pain. If fingers are lost as a result of leprosy, where the finger that was lost had no sensation in it, they often don't have a phantom finger. So there does seem to be some carryover, some memory into the phantom of what was there before. The gentleman at the back, yes.
Yeah, I wrote you a couple of questions at lunchtime. I'd like to raise the second one. And that I mentioned about when Gary Schwartz published his afterlife studies, and also his theory about how information stays around forever like starlight does.
Yes.
I was most surprised after all that. I asked him if he believed that this would ever be treatable by hard science. It definitely, he says, someday there's going to be an ability to measure these subtle energies. Interesting, because that's really holding on to hard science and materialism. I'm wondering if you think someday, long after you're gone, somebody will have a morphic resonance meter.
Well, I think in a sense every living organism is a morphic resonance meter. You see, I don't think we need necessarily have an electrical device to measure morphic fields. I mean, we don't measure gravitational fields with electrical meters. We measure them with pendulums and weights and things. You have to measure every kind of field by the appropriate means. Quantum matter fields are measured through quantum effects, not through electromagnetic meters, unless you're looking at photons or something. So I don't know. Gary Schwartz is a rather ambiguous figure, and I know Gary well. I've known him for a long time. Some of you may be familiar with his book, The Afterlife Experiments. He's done some innovative work on mediums and communication, apparent communication from departed spirits. Well, Gary Schwartz, in an earlier incarnation, when he was a professor of psychology at Yale, was one of the people. He won the first prize in the 1984 morphic resonance competition that was sponsored by the Tarrytown Foundation of New York. There was a $10,000 prize for the best test of morphic resonance. Gary Schwartz won it. And Gary and I used to visit him at Yale, and he's a very good experimentalist. Both of us love thinking of experiments. We used to spend all night sometimes thinking of wild experiments. And his experiment on morphic resonance was very interesting. It wasn't one that involved some materialistic theory. It was one where he was trying to find evidence for this collective memory. He did an ingenious test where people were looking at Hebrew letters, Hebrew words written in Hebrew. And he worked on the principle that if morphic resonance happens, real Hebrew words that have been read by Jewish people over thousands of years should be easier to remember. And he took real Hebrew words from the Old Testament. He wanted ones that had been read over at least 2,000 or more years. And he formed fake Hebrew words. And then he did experiments with students who didn't know any Hebrew. And he found that they were more able to recognize the real Hebrew words than the fake Hebrew words, even though they didn't know any Hebrew. And there was no known explanation for this other than morphic resonance.
Were they Jewish?
No, they were non-Jewish students. He deliberately filtered out Jewish students on the grounds they might have seen these words in synagogues and things. He also asked people to guess the meaning of the words, and any Jewish people who were able to guess the meanings, he excluded anyone who guessed the meanings correctly, even though that might have been a very impressive evidence of morphic resonance rather than residual memory. I describe this in my book, The Presence of the Past. Gary then lay low for many years, thinking heretical ideas but not coming out into the open. And then science is full of closet holists. I'm always meeting people who are sympathetic to these kinds of ideas but say, I can't talk about them to my colleagues and so on. Well, Gary spent quite a number of years not talking anymore about this. And then he really plunged in at the deep end by starting this work on spirit communication through mediums, which is, it's an area where I must say I've never been tempted. It's so controversial that he's really plunged in, and he's now got all the skeptics they're always on to me, but they're on to Gary even more. So, yes, I'm puzzled by, in his book, he wrote a book before the afterlife experiments, The Living Energy Universe, where he puts forward the theory there's just a kind of memory in light and in electromagnetic radiation, which is a curiously materialistic theory of memory. But when I talk to Gary about this, he flips from one side to the other. One, it's subtle, known forms of energy that ultimately might be found out by conventional science in a future thing. And then 5 minutes later, he'll be talking about things more like morphic resonance that aren't standard electromagnetism. So I think he's very ambiguous about it. Right at the back in the other room.
Has your research covered the thoughts of intention or human will on the morphic resonance?
Yes, I've mostly been investigating the effects of intention in my new book, The Sense of Being Stared At. I've been looking at the effects of attention and intention through what I call the extended mind. I think intentions can have an effect at a distance. That's what's happening in telephone telepathy, for example. You intend to call someone, you look up their number, you dial their number, your intention's reaching out to that person, and they may pick it up and start thinking about you. Of course, the realm of human intention it's a big field of inquiry. And how intention is involved, for example, in positive thinking, bringing about things through what theosophists call thought forms, or indeed as a channel through which the influence of prayer may work? These are all very big questions, and I don't think we've really got time to go into them now, but I think intention is a key to the way in which our minds work and project into the world around us. Interestingly, the very words attention and intention imply a stretching of the mind. Attention comes from the Latin root ad tendere, which means to stretch towards. Intention means to stretch into. And intention really means the mind is stretching into something. Attention means it's stretching towards something. And I think the mind really is literally stretching out beyond the brain. And we direct our minds through attention and intention.